Sumantra, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Sumantra, you used to work at the National Interest, then you worked at the American Conservative.
Yes.
And you have played a significant role, if perhaps underestimated somewhat by the media, in determining Trump foreign policy vis-a-vis Europe. Now, you wrote a provocative and highly read piece in Foreign Affairs called essentially The Case for a Dormant NATO.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, I won't go that far as to say, I played a significant role. And you were my mentor. You forgot to mention that in CFD&I. You got me here. So fundamentally, dormant NATO, which is parts of it you can see in the National Security Strategy, it has got three pillars. One, I don't want to go to the historical background as to why it is needed. Obviously, because of structural reasons, the U.S. Relative power of the U.S. declined vis-a-vis China and Russia. But fundamentally, dormant NATO has got three pillars. One, burden shifting, which, as you obviously know, no one talks about burden sharing anymore. The thing has changed. The dynamic of the debate has changed to burden shifting now. So burden shifting is one of the pillars of dormant NATO. It came out in dormant NATO first, where we shift all the conventional deterrents to Europeans, other than the nuclear power and the naval power, the Second Fleet, which is based there. So that's one. Second pillar of dormant NATO is a pause on all NATO expansion. NATO needs to be a closed defensive club, and it needs to shut its gate. Because if you don't have a fixed entity, if you have a mutating entity, then you cannot have a fixed grand strategy for that entity. So it's quite logical that you would have to close the gates of NATO. So, the curse of geography, if you're out of it, you're out of it, tough luck. But if you're in, you're safe. The third pillar of NATO, dormant NATO, is no out-of-area operations. So NATO was a defensive institution. It needs to go back to being a defensive institution, not in Serbia or Libya. That's not in the remit of NATO. No tweets about, social issues or democracy. Again, that is not a remit of NATO. So fundamentally, these are the three, pillars of dormant NATO. One, burden shifting, conventional deterrence to the Europeans, closing the gates of NATO from any further enlargement, and no out-of-area operations. From what we have seen so far in this new administration and in the new security strategy doctrine or the national defense strategy, the first two pillars seems to be, are the two things that the administration is looking into. I wouldn't say it is because of dormant NATO, but I would say that it very, it parallels the policy suggestions that was in dormant NATO paper. So NATO expansion and no NATO expansion and conventional burden shifting.
Now, your take on NATO is very much in the spirit of realists such as George F. Kennan, is it not?
Kennan was perhaps a little bit more restrained compared to me. I definitely do think he's a realist. There's no question about it. He's also a little bit more social conservative when it comes to NATO, which I'm not. I do think NATO is important. There are some on the realist and restrained side of political, political science, who would go as far as to say that U.S. doesn't need NATO. The United States can just come out of NATO and things are going to be fine. Possibly it would be fine, but it would also mean a return of some very older elements of European statecraft, which we haven't seen for around 100 years now. And whether that is a good or a bad thing is something for history to say. I wouldn't be that confident to claim that it would be a walk in the park. So I'm a little different, my suggestions would be a little different. I would go back to the original intention of NATO. NATO is a good institution as long as it works. It hasn't been working in the last 20, 30 years. And to return to a more original, conventional idea of the defense alliance is something that everyone should aspire to do. This simple idea of conventional burden shifting is not difficult. Like in 1989, you have seen Western European powers who used to spend a whole bunch of money on the defense. Elbridge Colby constantly talks about Germany. It's a classic example. In 1989, Germany had 12 divisions of army. Now they don't. The reason they don't is because we have incentivized them not to have. Part of the reason is their frontiers have moved east. They have got buffers between them and Russia. Why on earth? There are American men who are guarding the Baltic states. Why would a Western European nation, a powerful Western European nation like France or Germany or the United Kingdom, spend more on their defense and not on their social policies when they have other people guarding their borders?
So the Germans did send troops to the Baltics.
They did. It's 4,000 people. So it's the 45th Panzer Brigade, which is now in Lithuania after a lot of coaxing. And that's a good thing. I think that is partly because they are facing pressure of American withdrawal. And I think that is incentivizing them, which again proves the point. Like, at the end of the day, regardless of what a state says, how much threat it actually feels is revealed in its preferences. If Germany is spending money again on defense and sending troops to guard the borders, which means they are actually facing the pressure, which means the pressure works and we should keep doing it.
How about the summit meeting, the NATO summit meeting in Ankara, Turkey? Was that, in fact, a victory for Trump because the Europeans again committed to spend more on defense?
I think it's a little bit more complicated. I think under all the rhetoric of this summit, fundamentally nothing really has changed other than the fact that Germany is intending to spend a lot more on defense, which is a net positive for America. Germany is the real special relationship in Europe. It's not the UK, it's not France, it's Germany. It's the middle of Europa, it's right in the center. It's the biggest power. And it is pro-American. Like, German culture is much more American than UK or France, which have got, they have got their own strategic culture centers. But other than that, nothing really has changed. There is a lot of commitment from Europe. Commitments don't really mean action on the ground. In any case, it's going to take time anyway. It's not going to be overnight. So, yes, there are pledges from various countries about spending more. But European research on burden shifting is lacking in some ways. For some reason, they wait for cues coming from America as to what they want to do without taking any kind of proactive action. I think that is wrong. I do think, the example that you mentioned, Germany placing 4,500 troops or 5,000 troops in Lithuania, is a good example. Those are the kind of mini ententes that I wrote about in Dormant NATO that needs to be done more. If France and Greece institutionalizes their defense partnership, if Turkey and Germany institutionalizes their defense partnerships, then those are the kind of things that they can do on their own without any kind of support from America or any kind of NATO institutional support. And technically, they're well within their rights to do that. The fact that it's not happening could mean two things. One, there is inertia in some of the European states. And second, they're still waiting and hoping that Trump is an aberration. And there would be a return back to the old Atlanticist ways. I think that's a mistake. I think that is not going to happen. I think the fundamental character of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party has changed. I think the trends that you see in 20 years' time is going to be very different, not to mention the structural realities of a rising Chinese power. If tomorrow if the hammer really, falls in the East, it's going to be nothing compared to what we have seen so far. Like the Iran war, the Ukraine war will dwarf, in comparison to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And at that point in time, again, as Elbridge Colby constantly warned them, like at that point in time, we're out. Like there is no, it's precipitous. There is no gradual decline of U.S. troops. If there's a war, in Asia, our troops are out of Europe. And I don't think the Europeans are ready for that scenario.
How aggressive do you think Putin is?
Extremely aggressive. He's
Do you think he wants to reconstitute the old Russian Empire?
No, I don't think so. I think he's an opportunist. I think he sees. Look, I wrote a book on Russian grand strategy, and if you really have to study Russian grand strategy, you have to ignore the kind of rhetoric that comes out of Kremlin or the tweets or their communiques. It's fundamentally about what they're actually doing on the field. And if Russia really wants to reconstitute their empire, one, they cannot do that. They don't have the manpower, and more importantly, they don't have the technological supremacy. They are fundamentally, in one way, Putin is right. They are fighting against NATO, just not officially. They're going against, it's one single country with the help of China and North Korea, which is going against 28 other countries in Europe. So by that logic, he's right. But on the other hand, that also means that he cannot really do much about things. Like, unless he's declaring war on NATO, which he won't, or unless NATO joins the Ukraine conflict, which they haven't so far, and I seriously doubt they will, I think it is a stalemate. I think he understands that. I think threat is capability plus intention. I think his intention is to grasp as much as he can and create his own legacy. He wants to be remembered by history. He's a 78-year-old man with a very strange, skewered sense of boomer history, and he wants his name written in gold. He wants to be considered as Peter the Great or something of that sort. But he's not. The Russians are not capable. For good or for bad. They tried and they failed. They couldn't conquer Ukraine. It's unlikely they're gonna conquer the Baltic states. They can start up tensions, but that's gonna be a policing problem. They can pour a whole bunch of money in riots and stuff like that. But again, that is not a military issue. And they absolutely cannot conquer Poland or Germany or France and, threaten the English Channel. It's just not happening. They don't have the navy. They cannot even get close to Odessa. So I think we have to keep the idea of Putin in proportion. He's definitely an opportunist. He's definitely an aggressive guy. He's definitely interested in taking as much as he can and reconstitute at least some part of buffer state between the Russians and the Europeans. As you obviously know, there is, in Russian strategic culture, there is no word for safety. Like, the closest that you can get safety is Bishop Parsonage, which is known danger. They have historically faced invasion from the West, and it's understandable that they would want to create a buffer. But that doesn't mean that they're capable of doing it, and I would want to keep that in mind when we are dealing with Putin.
Now, a number of analysts have likened America's attack on Iran to Putin's war in Ukraine, in the sense that it was based on an illusion, that we're mired, that we were overconfident and thought we could wrap this up in a few days. Or do you think that's an exaggerated comparison?
I don't think that comparison makes sense. I think it looks similar, a great power going against a smaller power, thinking that they're going to roll over, but it doesn't happen. But the basic causal mechanism is very different. Putin was under no illusion that Ukraine is not a threat to Russia. Like, in his mind, this is the end line. I have to draw a line in the sand. He has seen for 20 years the inexorable march of NATO. You remember when he met George W. Bush, and he was actually quite happy about it. There's a whole chapter in my book on that, how he was the first person to come to Bush, and he welcomed the change of NATO to a political institution focusing on democracy, because he thought that fundamentally the idea of Russia is going to go away from NATO's mind, and then Russia and US are going to be on the same side, if not in an alliance, but against Islamism and all that. Obviously, again, he's an opportunist. They were fighting a war against Chechnya. That was a good way of, ensuring that America doesn't care about Chechnya. So all of those things to say, he was under no illusion that NATO is a changed character now, and Russia is still in NATO's mind. The Iran war on our side is baffling. Iran is not a threat to the United States or the interests of the United States. The entire Iranian grand strategy for the last 15 years was to fund proxies, and Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthis. That failed. After October 7th, Israel literally wiped off, their major, forward positioning. And obviously then, Israel went too far, and, it's like a shark, cannot stop swimming, But fundamentally, the Iranian grand strategy failed. Iran is a shadow of what it used to be, or what it was considered to be in 10, 15 years back. Imagine the surge in Iraq and how massive the threat of Iran was. That's gone. Those days are gone. That being said, it is also a country of 90 million people, surrounded by mountains. There was never going to be a land invasion of Iran without like 1 million American soldiers, trying to topple the regime. The people are not interested in toppling the regime. In fact, we have seen a rally around the flag effect in Iran. So it's a complicated scenario where Iran is a power in its own neighborhood, but it is not a hegemonic threat in the region. Now, from the United States side, I think the Venezuela intervention went to our head. I think we realized that we can do that in Venezuela. We could do the exact same thing in Iran. Now, that's obviously is a fundamentally causal mistake. I mean, there is a whole bunch of people who are like, "Oh, Israel dragged us to war." Potentially, I don't know, but that doesn't take away the blame of our own stupidity. We thought that Iran would be like Venezuela, whereas Venezuela is in the Western Hemisphere and it's like a extremely fragile state. Iran isn't. It is, at the end of the day, a theocracy. A theocracy has got a bureaucracy which works for it. It's ideologically a lot more coherent than Venezuela. Those are our decisions. We made those decisions.
It is an ideologically militant regime, which Trump seems to have underestimated.
I don't think it's militant. I think it's a survivalist regime. It's definitely ideological, but its fundamental aim is survival. From the perspective of Iran, they understand that if we go, so the major three factors in the Middle East, in my perspective, was Israel, obviously, a strong, powerful state, as Kenneth Walsh wrote. Part of the reason the Israelis, think that Iranians and the other countries are threats to them, but from the Iranian side, it is the Israeli power which makes them, it's kind of like the same spiral. The fact that Israel can go and bomb Osirak in Iraq or Syria with impunity without any fight back, it's not like the 70s, right? That incentivizes the other powers to be in a spiral mode and build up their own power, and that creates this entire security dilemma. The other factor is Iran. The Iranians thought that we cannot compete with the Israelis, we cannot compete with the Americans, obviously. What we can do is have proxies and forward presence and fund the proxies. That strategy has failed. And the final, power, which is actually the true great power in the region, is Turkey, right? We are now seeing a scenario where the Iranian-Israeli balancing is collapsing. There has always been like two phases of war. There has been no decision made now. Nothing has been, changed by force. And I don't think the president is interested in a ground operation. Otherwise, we would have been seeing forced movements. I think everyone in this administration understands how difficult that might be. There are people who are cheering it up in the media. It is impossible to do a regime change in Iran without a catastrophic war. That is not happening. I think even the Israelis understand that. So what's happening now is we are seeing this constant operational stalemate between Israelis and Iranians, whereas Turkish power is rising, and then Israelis and Turkish power, they're trying to balance each other, with the Israelis kind of having like a tactical alignment with the Greeks and in Cyprus and Somaliland and Turkey with Syria and Lebanon. So I think that is now creating a new set of problem where that might, tomorrow be the major. And at that point in time, we'd be in real bind because Turkey is a treaty ally and Israel is obviously Israel. So, at that point in time, we don't really know what to do.
So you have served as a outside advisor to Vice President J.D. Vance.
I wouldn't go that far.
Or, which would be informal?
I know the Vice President's advisors. Yes, and they're friends of mine. But I wouldn't go as far as saying like I'm an advisor to them.
What is your take on his foreign policy views?
I think his take on the foreign policy is what it says on the sleeve. Like he's genuinely passionate about what Joe Biden came to power saying. Like, it's a foreign policy for the middle class. I think Joe Biden didn't do a foreign policy for the middle class. I think the VP, the vice president is genuinely interested in that. He wants to reshore. Now, there might be quibbles about whether they even could be done. Like my current research is about drones and manufacturing of drones in the United States. And I've realized and I've come to the sad conclusion that it probably cannot be done. Like we cannot simply not because Americans don't have talent. Of course they have. There are lots of good American smart kids who could be really good, drone manufacturers. But the fundamental problem of drone manufacturing is not just manufacturing a good drone, but about competing with other states. And we cannot compete with those states because our labor cost is simply too high. An American engineer would charge $4,000 a month compared to a Hungarian or a Turk or a Ukrainian who would do that for like $700.
Will we be relying on Ukraine in the future?
We could. I think that is, I mean, once the war is over.
Is that what Trump is thinking as well? He seemed very receptive to the idea of.
I think the president wants to have a good deal in Russia. I think the problem that's facing the administration in both Russia and Iran is fundamentally that we cannot stop two belligerents if we are not ourselves a co-belligerent. We don't really have that much control as we think we do. It's the same case with Israel and Iran. So the second best thing is, the Teddy Roosevelt principle, the proclamation of neutrality between two belligerents. If you want to talk, Japan and Russia, come, we're going to help you talk. And after that, if there is peace, we're going to be the one guarantor of that peace. But so far, if you want to fight, we can't really do much about it, but we're not going to be a part of that. So I think that is something which the president needs to do.
Right.
He needs to tell the Israelis and the Iranians that if you want to fight, that's good on you. The Ukrainians and the Russians, good luck, fight as long as you want to, but we are not going to be a part of it.
Well, we are inextricably involved in the Middle East right now.
That's a mistake.
I want to get back to Ukraine. Could Ukraine be a powerhouse for the U.S. in the future in terms of technological innovation on drones and in the military sphere? Because our military bureaucracy seems stodgy and stuck in the past, and it's extremely expensive to manufacture anything in the U.S. Do we need to start outsourcing it more?
We absolutely. I mean, look, you obviously have seen, how social media is about outsourcing, stuff to India. It's going to be the same problem when you try to do that with Ukraine or Russia or Turkey. But fundamentally, we cannot do. The American way of life, the American cost, labor cost, establishment cost is just way too high. You have to understand that there are three strategies if you have to peer compete with someone who is much larger than you and has got a cheaper manufacturing base, China. The Chinese combined manufacturing base is larger than the United States, European Union, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand combined, right? We literally cannot compete with them on manpower. So what could be done? We could automate. That is not happening anytime soon. Or we could give a whole bunch of money to these 5 gigantic companies, 6 now if you consider Anduril as part of the top 5 and top 6. And they're going to spend and make platforms which are ridiculously expensive, and we're going to spend in that over-budgeted stuff, whereas the others, What is the core lesson of the Second World War? The Germans were not technologically incompetent, but they were making gigantic things and extremely expensive, whereas the Soviets and the Americans were making like really cheap, manufactured production. It's the same thing in reverse now. So what are the options? One, colonialism, very old school, the British Empire. You have the, India, that's the manufacturing hub of the British Empire, right? We are not a colonial power, so we are not going to do that. Second, outsource. You have understandings with countries which are in war, which have done, Turkey, for example, is a treaty ally. Their drone production company is one of the best, production sectors in the entire world. You have these kind of countries who actually can produce stuff, but you keep the IP. So you're not like selling, the weapons to them. You're essentially outsourcing the fundamental, the legwork.
As Trump is doing with the Patriots, right?
Right.
With Ukraine.
And I think that could be a very potential option. The problem with Ukraine is the Ukrainian manpower is also, going down at a pace which is, I mean, look, if this thing continues for the next 10, 20 years or 15 years, I don't think Ukraine is, we cannot even recognize that country anymore. I don't think we should wish that on them. I think, purely for the sake of humanity, we would want this war to stop. But fundamentally, Ukraine is losing 10% of its entire population now?
There's been a lot of emigration too.
Yeah, well, the emigration were mostly like women and children. It's still bad, but it's not the core manufacturing, manpower that a country needs. And I think that is a risk. But I do think that there are several European countries who are who can manufacture things a lot cheaper for us. Western Hemisphere, you need to figure out countries in Latin America, for example, that would incentivize them not coming here. If we can produce, manufacturing there, then that would also stop the migration issue that we have in the Southern Hemisphere. We have to figure out something where we are manufacturing stuff outside. I think the reshoring thing is probably not going to work. I know a lot of, from the political right would not like to hear that. They still have this idea of a 1950s, ask around, you go around. How many people want to work in, why do you think there is a labor shortage? Migration has stopped for the last 2 years. Why is still there a labor shortage? Is someone from a random country want to go and work in a coal mine anymore? I mean, it's kind of like a romanticized image that we have, which is only in social media, that we can just radically transform this country back to 1950s, a one-man family with, it's not going to happen. Times change.
What do you think is the biggest threat to the United States right now in terms of foreign policy?
Foreign policy?
Sounds like you think it's China.
It is, yes. China is a challenge. I wouldn't go as far as saying it's a threat. We don't really know what the Chinese really want to do. I think anyone who can claim that they understand the Chinese grand strategy is bluffing. There is, though, a risk of China being a hegemonic power in Asia. No country stocks up on food grains and gold and builds up their navy if they're not planning on a hegemonic run. It has never happened in history, So maybe they're benevolent. Maybe we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years how they're defending their interests in Africa or Afghanistan, where there are millions of Chinese working, and they're facing attacks from local people. If the Chinese send troops to defend them, then that's a clear sign that they are positioning themselves as a hegemonic power. We can see whether they want to have more conflicts with India, for example, in the Indian borders, and have more revisionist aims in the border. So those are going to be classic examples. But I do think the Chinese hegemonic threat is something that we should prepare for. Whether it's a decided factor or not, I have no idea. I don't really believe in the CDD strap as something which is predetermined. But I do think there is a possibility that China is one of the biggest threats to U.S.
Final question. How
Yes, sir.
satisfied are you overall with Trump's record on foreign policy so far?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think I am very happy with obviously the drafted elements that came out in the national security strategy and national defense strategy. Part of the reason is not because whether they're implemented or not this time, but basically the entire world sees the national security strategy as the guiding principle of the republic, which means then they prepare accordingly. So if the national security strategy is coming out and saying burden shifting is happening, whether you like it or not, the memo goes out, So that is a great thing that the Trump administration did. I was surprised as to how good the Venezuela operation was. Clearly, the administration had information that we were not privy to outside, and it was very smooth. And it was actually really good. Again, if we are genuinely thinking of China as a peer rival, and we want to get out of the Middle East after this conflict, we would have to have a stockpile of fuel, which is defensible and in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela is a classic real estate in that in that place. I think in Europe we have talked a big game, but we haven't really done much. I don't know why we are not moving troops out of the Biden surge that happened because of the Ukraine war. That's an easy thing to do. I do think there are some under sub-level operational changes that's happening, but I think we can do a lot more in Europe. I think the Middle East question is an absolute failure. It goes against everything that MAGA or even America First stood for. And I think the Greenland thing is best unsaid. I do think Greenland is important for America, but I think there is a much better way of going about it.
What's the better way?
Oh, where do you want me to even start? It's going to take half an hour. I wrote an entire paper on that one. We shouldn't be seen as a colonial power hell-bent on annexing. There's a lot more things that we can actually do with Greenland currently, even with Denmark. We can invest in their hospitality sectors. We can have regular flights coming from US to Denmark, to Greenland as tourists. We can invest in hotels and restaurants and chains. We can have an open visa program with Denmark and Greenland where Americans can go and work and come back. We can change the troop bases and literally move like as much troops as we want and put 100,000 Americans there, and that would create, it's like, think of Germany in 1950s. It creates its own, system. It creates its own society. It creates its own, ecosystem in a way. So there's a lot of things that we can do. It would help the Greenlanders. It would help the Danes. The Danes are producing, for example, a whole bunch of smart engineers. They can come and work in American companies in Greenland. We can create something which is beneficial to all three entities. And that Denmark could be kind of like the Switzerland of North, or the Singapore. A lot of things could be done without open threats of annexation. I think the American way of influence is a little different than the British Empire. I think one needs to read a lot more British imperial history as to see what they did in 1850s with the doctrine of lapse and all that kind of stuff. But again, like it's a whole new discussion. But fundamentally, we should calm down with the threats of annexation and try and invest in Greenland a lot more. They're very open about mining and basing and hospitality, and they don't really have the manpower. So we can figure out a way where we invest there and have our people go and work there and in work visas. And in 20 years' time, it's going to be a very different game.
Sumantra, thank you for these incisive remarks.
Thank you for having me today.